December 3rd, 1945. Sugamo Prison, Tokyo. Admiral Takahara sat at his desk, his pen moving slow but steady across the page. He was writing things that, a few months earlier, would have gotten him executed. This man, former commander of Cruiser Division 5, a veteran of 7 major sea battles, was putting down a truth he'd suspected ever since the bloodbath at the Philippine Sea. The Americans just kept coming. They replaced their losses before we could even count our wins. It felt like fighting the ocean itself. No matter how much water you smash, there's always more. Outside, Tokyo stretched on, just ruins now. The city burned flat by B-29s that showed up in numbers nobody in Japan had ever dreamed possible. In the harbor, American warships, bigger than anything Japan could even imagine, sat at anchor. Their crews lounged around, tending to machines that contained more steel than whole Japanese cities ever had. Sugamo's interrogation rooms had turned into confessionals. Japan's naval leaders finally faced a reality they'd spent years ignoring, or had simply been ordered not to see. They'd picked a fight with an industrial giant, one that crushed Japan not by a slim margin, but by numbers so huge they were hard to even grasp. The testimony they gave for the United States Strategic Bombing Survey didn't just spell out military defeat. It exposed the entire fantasy of ever keeping up with American industry. What came out of those sessions was the most thorough admission of industrial inferiority any military had ever recorded. Senior Japanese officers, one after another, sat down and explained how they'd led their nation into war against a country that could build more planes in 1 month than Japan could in a year. The delusion started long before the first shots. Yamamoto tried to warn them. Back in the 1920s, Admiral Yamamoto, later the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, spent 2 years at Harvard, then 2 more in Washington as a naval attaché. He came home and sounded the alarm, but nobody listened. In January 1941, he wrote a letter to Navy Minister Koshiro Owa. Anyone who's seen Detroit's car factories or the Texas oil fields knows Japan can't compete with America at sea. He was right, of course. Captain Minoru Genda, who'd later helped plan Pearl Harbor, visited the U.S. on a military mission in 1940. He toured Boeing's Seattle plant and saw B-17s rolling off the line, mass-produced in ways Japan simply couldn't match. Mitsubishi needed 3 weeks for a twin-engine bomber. Americans finished theirs in days. The numbers were brutal, but they were right there for anyone willing to look. When a Mitsubishi team visited Douglas Aircraft in California, they counted 6,000 workers on a single shift building DC-3s. Soon to become the C-47, the war's workhorse transport. The entire Japanese aircraft industry only had 35,000 people across all companies. One American factory had nearly a fifth of Japan's total workforce. Still, the Imperial General Headquarters shrugged it off. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, told Emperor Hirohito in September 1941, "American workers are soft, undisciplined. Their factories make junk. We'll beat them with Japanese spirit and better training." Post-war interrogations showed they had the real numbers all along. They just ignored them. In 1941, America made 19.4 million tons of steel. Japan, 5.8 million. America refined 4.3 million barrels of oil each day. Japan scraped by with 55,000 barrels, most of it stolen from conquered lands. Pearl Harbor looked like a win, at first. December 7th, 1941. In 90 minutes, the Japanese Navy wrecked 8 battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, killed 2,403 Americans. It seemed like they'd knocked out the American Pacific Fleet. But Admiral Nagumo, who led the attack, saw a different story. Later, during interrogation, he admitted what worried him. "We only found old battleships, no carriers. Worse, we left the oil tanks, the submarine base, the repair yards. They were untouched." Commander Genda, flying overhead, spotted something that made his blood run cold. In his testimony to American interrogators, he said the harbor held more auxiliary ships, tankers, tenders, cargo vessels, than the entire Japanese Navy owned. Not even warships, just support vessels. And they outnumbered our whole battle fleet. The Japanese fleet set out for Pearl Harbor, thinking they were about to deal a crippling blow to America's main Pacific base. Turns out, Pearl Harbor was just one of many. San Diego, Bremerton, Mare Island, Hunter's Point. Each one rivaled or even surpassed Japan's top naval yard at Yokosuka. Then came the shock of the Coral Sea. In May 1942, during that battle, Americans got their first real test. The USS Yorktown came limping back to Pearl Harbor, badly battered and leaking from Japanese bombs. Japanese analysts figured it would take at least 3 months, maybe 6, to fix a carrier that beat up because that's how long it would have taken them. But the Americans had other ideas. On May 27th, the Yorktown hit dry dock. 1,400 workers swarmed over her, running on little sleep and pure adrenaline. They rigged up rolling power plants to keep the lights blazing and the welders sparking all night. Custom-cut steel plates were stacked and waiting. In just 3 days, Yorktown was patched up and ready for another fight. She set sail for Midway on May 30th. Meanwhile, the Japanese carrier Shokaku also hit at Coral Sea, sat in Yokosuka for 11 weeks before it could rejoin the fleet. After the war, analysts dug into the details. American shipyards had rows of pneumatic tools, electric welders, and as much steel as they needed. Japanese shipbuilders made do with hand tools and whatever scraps they could find. Midway changed everything. June 4th, 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These weren't just ships. They were the heart of the Japanese carrier force. They were gone for good. Admiral Matsugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote in his diary that the Americans would replace their losses in a year, while Japan wouldn't catch up in 10. He was being optimistic. The U.S. had already started building Essex-class carriers, with the first one ready that December. By the end of the war, the U.S. had finished 17 Essex-class carriers and 9 Independence-class light carriers. Japan managed only 3 more fleet carriers, total. The air war was even more lopsided. At Midway, Japan lost 248 planes and 110 veteran pilots, the kind you just can't replace. America lost 150 planes and 60 air crew. 6 weeks later, U.S. carrier air groups were back to full strength, with fresh planes and trained pilots. Japan never recovered from that blow. Guadalcanal drove the point home. From August 1942 to February 1943, the two navies slugged it out in 7 major battles. The losses look close on paper. America lost 29 ships, Japan lost 38, but the aftermath told a different story. 6 months after Guadalcanal, the U.S. fleet was bigger than ever. Japan struggled just to replace its destroyers. The supply lines really showed the gap. Japanese destroyers, the so-called Tokyo Express, risked everything to ferry 240 tons of supplies per run to Guadalcanal. American Liberty ships, rolling off the assembly line at 3 a day, hauled 10,000 tons per trip. One cargo ship did the job of 40 Japanese destroyer runs. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal starved, their combat strength down to 30% by December. Meanwhile, American soldiers griped about boring food while eating 4,700 calories a day. The production numbers almost didn't seem real. By early 1943, Japanese intelligence had solid American figures, and the numbers hit like a punch to the gut. They were so bleak, Japan classified them above top secret. Here's a snapshot from March 1943. The U.S. churned out 7,200 aircraft. Japan managed 650. In engines, 18,000 to 1,200. The U.S. trained 12,000 pilots that month. Japan, just 300. Warships, U.S. launched 48, Japan 3. Merchant ships, 140 to 8. Submarines, 8 to 2. Rear Admiral Sakichi Takagi, reading those stats, told his colleagues, "If these numbers are even half true, we're already beaten." He wasn't exaggerating. They were actually on the low side. U.S. production was still ramping up. The Willow Run plant alone cranked out 650B, 24 bombers every month. Japan's entire heavy bomber output during the whole war, 15 planes. By June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what Americans call the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the difference was impossible to miss. Japan scraped together 9 carriers and 473 planes. The U.S. showed up with 15 carriers and 956 planes. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, who led the Japanese fleet, would later testify about what he saw. There was just no way to keep up. Our pilots barely got 200 hours of flight training. Then we found out American pilots had to log at least 600 hours before they went into combat. We didn't even have fuel to practice. They trained nonstop. The technology gap hurt just as much. American carriers sent out F-6F Hellcats, 2,000 horsepower, .50 caliber machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating. Our Zeros? Pretty much the same as in 1940. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, just 950 horsepower engines. You can guess what happened. Japan lost 476 planes and 3 carriers. The Americans lost 130 planes, no ships. We lost 480 aircrew. That's 8 months' worth of pilot training. Gone. The Americans lost 76 aircrew, then replaced them in a few days. Their training programs cranked out 3,000 naval aviators every month. Then came the B-29s. Each bomber cost more than most government buildings, $639,000 apiece. When the first B-29 superfortresses showed up over Tokyo in November 1944, they flew from Saipan 1,500 miles out. The U.S. built almost 4,000 of them. The program cost $3 billion, which was more than Japan's entire yearly military budget. Every superfortress packed 55,000 parts built to tolerances we couldn't even measure. Pressurized cabins, remote control gun turrets, bombing computers. Things we couldn't hope to copy, not even with 10 years to catch up. B-29 raids weren't just destructive. They showed off a level of industrial output we couldn't even imagine. Each round trip was 3,000 miles and burned 6,000 gallons of fuel per plane. A single 500-plane raid used 3 million gallons, which was all the aviation fuel Japan could produce in a month. Take the March 9, 10, 1945 Tokyo firebombing. 1,665 tons of incendiaries dropped, 16 square miles of the city wiped out. In that one night, they dropped more bombs on us than the entire Japanese Air Force had in stock. Okinawa was another wake-up call. In April 1945, the Americans came with 1,457 ships, more than the Imperial Japanese Navy ever had, at any point in its history. Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi, who created the Kamikaze Corps, put it bluntly before he killed himself. I counted over 100 destroyers in the screening force. We have 11 left in the whole Navy. Kamikaze attacks, 1,900 of them, sank 36 ships and damaged 368. But every ship they lost, they replaced in 2 months. Most of the damaged ones were back in action, too. Every day, American supply ships offloaded 50,000 tons of food, ammo, fuel, medicine. Our entire merchant fleet couldn't move that much in a week, even if we sent everything we had. Submarines? That was another disaster for us. American subs made up just 2% of their Navy's personnel, but they sank 60% of our shipping, 4.8 million tons. The U.S. built 228 submarines during the war, all on assembly lines. We managed 126, built by hand. By 1945, our shipyards could only turn out 500,000 tons of ships a year. The Americans built that much in a single month with their Liberty ships. Their subs had air conditioning, cold storage, ice cream machines, washing machines. Ours ran in 120-degree heat. The crews lived on rice and pickled vegetables and got sick with scurvy. By August 1945, the numbers spoke for themselves. When Hirohito finally announced a surrender, American officers sat down with our commanders and asked for the real figures. The scale of the difference was just staggering. Admiral Shigeru Toyota, final commander of the combined fleet, summed it up: the U.S. had endless resources and factories. Japan's steel production, 6 million tons a year. America's, 80 to 100 million. Military aircraft. America built 324,750. Japan, 76,320. Tanks. America, 88,410. Japan, just 2,515. Military trucks. America, nearly 2.4 million. Japan, 166,000. Aircraft carriers. America, 141. Japan, 17. Battleships. America, 10. Japan, 2. Cruisers. America, 48. Japan, 6. Destroyers. America, 349. Japan, 63. Submarines. America, 228. Japan, 126. Admiral Yamamoto had warned us before the war. He understood the numbers. He was killed in 1943, shot down by American P-38s after they broke our codes. But his predictions, written down in the Naval Archives, turned out to be exactly right. In September 1941, Yamamoto wrote to Navy Minister Owa, "If Japan and the United States go to war, it's not enough to just take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. We'd have to march right into Washington and force peace terms in the White House. I wonder if our politicians really believe we can pull this off, or if they're ready to pay the price." His most chilling prediction came in a letter to Admiral Inu Shigeyoshi. "For the first 6 months, maybe a year, I'll win victory after victory against the U.S. and Britain. After that, I have no confidence at all." Japan's technical officers saw the writing on the wall. They understood the sheer industrial gap between Japan and the United States. During USSBS interrogations after the war, Japanese naval constructors explained it in blunt terms. American welding was 5 years ahead. Americans welded whole ship sections in factories, snapping them together like giant puzzles. Japan still riveted each plate by hand. In American shipyards, one worker did the job of 10 Japanese. The quality difference was just as stark. Captured American equipment showed that every part was machined to exact tolerances, fully interchangeable between planes. Japan had to hand-fit every piece. Americans mass-produced better quality than Japan could manage by hand. When the occupation began, the truth hit home. On August 30th, 1945, General MacArthur landed at Tsuji Airfield, and in the first weeks, Japanese officers saw overwhelming proof of America's industrial might. Hundreds of American warships filled Tokyo Bay, more naval power than Japan ever had, and this wasn't even a full U.S. fleet. Within weeks, Americans had phone networks, postal services, radio stations, and transport systems up and running, all superior to anything Japan built in decades. They fixed bombed-out cities faster than Japan had built them in the first place. Food distribution during the occupation told the same story. America sent $1.7 billion in aid, with $1.19 billion just in food and farm supplies. A single Liberty ship brought in 10,000 tons of wheat, enough to feed a city for months. Hundreds of these ships arrived, feeding the whole country, while Americans back home never went hungry. Japanese agricultural experts were stunned. One American farmer produced food for 27 people. Most Japanese farmers barely fed their own families. America's surplus alone could have kept Japan running. The oil numbers were even more brutal. Japanese naval officers always knew oil was a weakness, but the real gap was staggering. Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies hoping for 5 million tons of oil a year. The U.S. produced that much every 4 days. In its best year, Japan made 2.7 million barrels total, while America pumped out 1.7 billion barrels, 60% of the world's supply. The ratio was 151 to 1. That one number says everything about why the war ended the way it did. Electronics was another canyon. By 1945, every American ship bristled with radar, search, fire control, navigation. Japan's best ships had maybe one, and it barely worked. The American proximity fuse, a tiny radar in every anti-aircraft shell, made their guns 5 to 10 times deadlier. Japan couldn't even mass-produce basic vacuum tubes, while America built 22 million proximity fuses. At MIT's radiation lab, 4,000 people spent $1.5 billion developing over 100 radar systems. Japan had just 300 staff on naval electrical research by 1943. And then there's the human factor. America trained 250,000 pilots during the war. Japan managed 45,000, and their training hours dropped off a cliff. In 1941, elite Japanese pilots got 600 to 700 hours. By 1944, Navy pilots got 40. Army pilots got just 60 to 70 by 1945. Meanwhile, American trainees got more and more flight time, averaging over 525 hours by 1944. Americans used more fuel just in training than Japan did in actual combat. In the end, Japan's officers saw it bluntly. America's industrial, technological, and human resources simply overwhelmed them. The numbers told the whole story. Let's talk about the numbers that shaped the war. Take Kaiser's shipyards. He ran 7 of them, and those yards alone turned out 27% of all the ships the Maritime Commission needed. After the war, Japanese naval architects came to visit American shipyards and left stunned. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the scale. At peak, Kaiser's Richmond shipyards had 100,000 workers, more than the entire Japanese shipbuilding workforce. In total, those 7 yards cranked out 1,490 ships. That's more than a quarter of all the Maritime Commission vessels. The Richmond yards would finish a Liberty ship every 42 days, and once they built the SS Robert E. Peary in just under 5 days. Try beating that. When it came to the battlefield, the numbers didn't get any kinder for Japan. America's self-sealing tanks and powerful engines gave their planes an edge. The stats tell the story. Japan lost 476 aircraft and 3 carriers in one campaign, while America lost 130 planes, but not a single ship. Japan lost 480 aircrew. That's 8 months' worth of pilot training. Gone. America lost 76, but their training programs pumped out 3,000 new naval aviators every month, so replacements arrived almost instantly. Then there's the B-29. Now, each one of those bombers cost $639,000, more than most government buildings in Japan. The U.S. built nearly 4,000 of them, pouring $3 billion into the program. That was more than Japan's entire military budget for a year. Every B-29 was a marvel. 55,000 precision-made parts, pressurized cabins, remote control guns, and bombing computers. Japan just couldn't match that, not even with 10 years to try. When the first B-29 showed up over Tokyo in late 1944, it was like something from another planet. They flew 1,500 miles from the Marianas, dropped their bombs, and made the 3,000-mile round trip, each burning 6,000 gallons of fuel. A single raid with 500 bombers used up 3 million gallons, which was Japan's entire monthly aviation fuel production. On March 9 to 10, 1945, American bombers dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo, destroying 16 square miles. That one raid used more bombs than Japan's whole Air Force had in stock. By April 1945, at Okinawa, America's industrial machine was in full swing. The invasion fleet had 1,457 ships, more than the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever sailed at one time. Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi, the man behind the kamikaze attacks, counted over 100 American destroyers just in the screening force. He admitted, "We have 11 destroyers left in our entire Navy." Japan sent 1,900 kamikaze attacks at Okinawa. They sank 36 ships and damaged 368. But every lost ship was replaced within 2 months, and most damaged ones were back in action. Supplies poured in 50,000 tons every day. Japan's entire merchant fleet couldn't move that much in a week. Now look at the submarines. Only 2% of American naval personnel served on subs, but they were responsible for sinking 60% of Japan's merchant shipping, 4.8 million tons. The U.S. built 228 submarines during the war, all on assembly lines. Japan managed 126, and each one was built by hand. By 1945, Japan's shipyards could only turn out 500,000 tons of shipping a year. For comparison, America's Liberty ship program cranked out that much every month. American subs had luxuries like air conditioning, cold storage, even ice cream machines. Japanese crews sweated it out in 120-degree heat. living on rice and pickled vegetables. Scurvy and beriberi were common. By August 1945, the war was over, but the numbers kept coming. When Emperor Hirohito surrendered, Japanese officers finally told American investigators the truth. Admiral Toyota, the last commander of Japan's combined fleet, summed it up in November 1945. The United States had more raw materials, more resources, and staggering production power. Japan's steel output was 6 million tons a year. America made 80 to 100 million. In the end, the math decided everything. Let's look at what total war production really meant. The numbers tell the story. The U.S. built 324,750 military aircraft during the war. Japan managed just 76,320. When it came to tanks, the U.S. rolled out 88,410, Japan only 2,515. Trucks? America produced over 2.3 million. Japan didn't even break 166,000. Aircraft carriers. The U.S. put 141 in the water, Japan 17. Battleships? America had 10, Japan 2. For cruisers, it was 48 to 6. Destroyers, 349 to 63. Submarines, 228 to 126. The difference is staggering. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who understood these numbers, saw it coming. He died in April 1943, shot down by American P-38s after U.S. codebreakers tracked him. But before the war, he'd already warned his superiors. In a letter to Navy Minister Owa in September 1941, Yamamoto didn't sugarcoat things. If war breaks out with the United States, it's not enough to take Guam, the Philippines, even Hawaii or San Francisco. We'd have to march into Washington and dictate peace in the White House. Do our politicians really believe we'll win? Are they ready for the sacrifices? His most chilling line came in a letter to Admiral Inu Shigeyoshi. For the first 6 months to a year, I'll run wild, win victory after victory. After that, I have no confidence at all. Japanese engineers could see the gap just as clearly. Technical officers, the ones who actually understood the nuts and bolts of war production, gave blunt testimony after the war. American welding techniques were 5 years ahead. U.S. shipyards welded giant sections together like assembling a puzzle. Japan still riveted plates one by one. One American worker could do what took 10 Japanese. The quality gap was obvious. U.S. parts were precisely machined and interchangeable. Japan hand-fitted every part. America mass-produced better than Japan could handcraft. When the war ended, the difference became impossible to ignore. On August 30th, 1945, General MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield and the occupation began. Japanese officers saw the American fleet in Tokyo Bay. Hundreds of warships, more than Japan ever built. And that wasn't even the whole U.S. Navy. In days, Americans set up phone lines, postal systems, radio stations, and transportation networks that ran better than anything Japan had built in decades. They repaired war damage faster than Japan could build new infrastructure. Food showed the gap in a different way. America sent $1.7 billion in aid. Over half of it just food and farm supplies. One Liberty ship could deliver 10,000 tons of wheat, enough to feed a city for months. Hundreds of these ships arrived, keeping Japan fed, while Americans back home never went hungry. Japanese agricultural experts looked at the numbers and realized one American farmer fed 27 people. A Japanese farmer barely fed his own family. America's surplus could feed all of Japan. Oil was the real killer. Japanese naval officers always knew they were in trouble, but the truth was worse than they thought. Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies for 5 million tons of oil a year. The U.S. pumped out that much every 4 days. In Japan's best year, they managed 2.7 million barrels. America, 1.7 billion barrels annually, 60% of the world's oil. The production ratio was 151 to 1. That single number explains almost everything about how the war ended. Technology? America pulled ahead there too. By 1945, every U.S. ship bristled with radar, search, fire control, navigation. Japan's best ships had a single, unreliable set. The proximity fuse changed anti-aircraft warfare completely. A tiny radar in each shell that exploded near enemy planes. Lethality jumped tenfold. America made 22 million of these fuses. Japan struggled to build basic vacuum tubes, let alone radar shells. MIT's radiation lab had 4,000 people and a $1.5 billion budget developing radar. Japan's naval electrical research staff in 1943? Just 300. This is what industrial disparity looked like. It wasn't just numbers on a page. It decided the war. Here's the real story, stripped down to what really mattered. 250,000 pilots versus 45,000. That's America's edge in human capital. Plain and simple. While Japan managed to train just 45,000 pilots, the U.S. put 250,000 through flight school, and the gap only grew as the war dragged on. In 1941, elite Japanese pilots trained for 600 to 700 hours. By 1943, Navy pilots got 275 hours, Army pilots just 130. In 1944, Navy pilot training dropped to 40 hours. In 1945, the Army managed 60 to 70 hours. Meanwhile, American pilots were logging more hours each year, averaging over 525 hours by 1944. The U.S. actually burned more fuel on training flights than Japan allocated for all its combat missions. Now, step into the shipyards. The numbers are just as lopsided. Kaiser's 7 shipyards alone turned out 27% of all U.S. ships. After the war, Japanese naval architects toured these places and couldn't believe what they saw. At peak, just the Richmond yards had 100,000 workers, more than Japan's entire shipbuilding workforce. Kaiser's yards built 1,490 ships, including the SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship slapped together in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. On average, Richmond launched a new Liberty ship every 42 days. Senior Japanese officers, when interrogated after the war, faced these numbers and admitted what they meant. Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, the Navy minister, said, "We knew the numbers, but believed Yamato's spirit could overcome material disadvantage. 1 Japanese soldier might equal 3 Americans in spirit, but 1 American factory equaled 50 Japanese factories in production." General Yashijiro Yumizu, the Army Chief of Staff who signed the surrender, put it bluntly, "We fought the last war with the last war's thinking. We brought swords to a factory fight. The economic gap was just as brutal. America spent $341 billion on the war. Japan's entire GDP in 1941, about $7 billion. America spent more on the Manhattan Project alone, $2 billion, than Japan's entire government had to spend in 1943. The U.S. funded the war with bonds people lined up to buy. Japan printed money, which triggered 300% inflation. The financial reality was absolute. There was no way Japan could catch up. Look at the production numbers. There's no arguing with them. The U.S. built 324,750 military aircraft. Japan built 76,320. That's over 4 to 1. Aircraft carriers, 141 for the U.S., 17 for Japan. Submarines, 228 to 126. Destroyers, 349 to 63. Merchant ships. The U.S. poured out 33,939,230 tons. Japan made for 1,152,361. Oil production. America pumped out 833 million tons, while Japan managed just 5.5 million. Steel. 334 million tons for the U.S., 24 million for Japan. Aluminum. 2.88 million tons to Japan's 375,000. Pick any metric, the U.S. was miles ahead. After the war, something unexpected happened. The same Japanese officers who'd seen American industry up close helped build their country's economic miracle. They took what they'd learned in defeat and turned it into a blueprint for peace. When Edwards Deming arrived in 1950 to teach quality control, Japan's top executives listened. Former military men started companies that copied American mass production for consumer goods. By 1960, Japan was building cars that could go toe-to-toe with American models. By 1970, Japanese electronics ruled the world. By 1980, Japan had achieved through industry what it failed to win by force: global influence and respect. In the end, these Japanese officers spelled out the lesson for all history. Modern war isn't really about courage or spirit. It's about numbers. Not warriors, but workers. Not swords, but factories. America had 10 times the industrial capacity, and that settled it before it even began. Japan never stood a chance. But by facing that reality, they helped shape a new world, one where factories build prosperity, not war, and former enemies become partners. Let's just look at the numbers. $341 billion versus $7 billion in GDP. After the war, it became painfully clear Japan never had a real shot. The U.S. spent $341 billion fighting the war. Japan's whole economy in 1941, about $7 billion. Just the Manhattan Project alone cost America $2 billion, more than Japan's entire government budget for 1943. The gap was unreal. How did they pay for all this? Americans bought war bonds willingly. Japan? They just printed money, and that led to 300% inflation. The numbers tell the whole story. U.S. factories churn out 324,750 military planes. Japan managed 76,320. That's more than 4 to 1. Aircraft carriers? The U.S. built 141. Japan only 17, 8 to 1. Submarine, destroyers, merchant ships. America outproduced Japan on every front. Oil production? The U.S. pumped out 833 million tons. Japan just 5.5 million. Steel and aluminum? Same story. The equation was impossible from the start. But something surprising happened after surrender. Japanese officers who saw firsthand how the U.S. built so much, so fast, ended up shaping Japan's post-war recovery. They studied American production methods, and those lessons turned into blueprints for Japan's own economic rise. When Edwards Deming showed up in 1950 to teach quality control, Japan's top business leaders listened. Former military men started companies, used what they'd learned, and soon Japan was building cars that could rival anything from Detroit. By the 1970s, Japanese electronics were everywhere. By the 1980s, Japan earned global influence and respect, not by force, but through industry. In the end, those Japanese officers admitted it. They'd misjudged everything. Modern war wasn't about bravery or spirit. It was about numbers, machines, and workers. America had 10 times the industrial capacity, and at the side of the war before it even started. But here's the twist. By understanding why they lost, Japan's leaders helped build a world where factories make peace, not war, where industry lifts people up and old enemies become partners. That's the real miracle, isn't it?